Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It's great to be back alongside you, Eugene. What a week.
What a week, and we've got even more breaking news coming as we start the show. The United States has passed the first procedural vote in a War Powers Act resolution that would require President Donald Trump to seek approval from Congress if he wants to do any further military action within or against Venezuela. That's the language of the resolution. The vote was 52-47. There will be another vote in Congress, the Senate, to actually pass it. It only requires a simple majority. It's expected to pass, but Trump may in fact veto the measure, and that would require, I think, 60 votes, if I'm not mistaken, to override that. So it may not make it, but nonetheless, I think what a week, Rania. And even in the sclerotic do-nothing Congress, it seems the outrage by 50% of disapproval of Donald Trump's actions reverberating even in Washington, D.C., amongst everything else going on in every corner of the globe in the country. So here we are, the Freedom Side, Eugene and Rania, to help you sort through it all.
Yeah, there's a lot to sort through. It's been a wild week. We've done what feels like 1 million live streams, which were necessary and continue to be necessary to bring you not just the news from our perspective, but give you a whole carousel of guests, people on the ground in Venezuela who we're going to be speaking to today. We're also going to cover a raging escalation in Yemen, which I don't even know if anyone's noticed because there's so much other stuff going on. It's hard to know what to focus on. But yeah, the Saudis and the Emiratis are fighting each other in Yemen. We're also going to be talking about the horrific ICE murder, street execution, I guess you can call it, of a woman in Minneapolis. But before we get to all of that, I do want to remind everybody that we are an independent media outlet. So I encourage you to support all of the incredible journalism we're doing here at Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Consider becoming a paying member for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch, such as this very cool Breakthrough News mug. Look at that. Look how pretty. Look how pretty my mug is. And then it says Breakthrough News on the other side of it. But most importantly, you'll be supporting independent media when all the other corporate media is bought up by like 1 or 2 or 3 people to give you right-wing crap that rots your brain. So I also want to encourage everybody who's watching to make sure you smash that like button.
Smash that
It helps.
like button.
It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. Make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News. Make sure that you have hit the bell for notifications, and make sure you hit all notifications so that you can get a notification whenever we publish new content, so you don't miss any of our amazing programming here at Breakthrough News. It is 2026, and it feels like it should already be the end of the year because too much has happened.
Yeah, it really does feel that way. When you said we've done several live streams, I was trying to remember, and it feels like it was 2 months ago, but it was just a few days ago, actually, on whatever it was over this past weekend where you and I and Zoe were together, and then you and Zoe were together on Tuesday. But nonetheless, you said it all, Rania, and I think you mentioned in that a story that is actually a huge story, but has been flying under the radar given everything else, is the ongoing situation in Yemen, where Saudi and Emirati-backed factions have been going at each other, so to speak. There's all sorts of things happening and allegations of delegations disappearing, territory being taken over, some significant shifts there. So we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Giorgio of Gulf State Analytics to help us figure out what's going on and where things may go in the future. Giorgio, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Always good to be with you guys.
Well, Giorgio, it seems to me like we're seeing a major escalation in southern Yemen. If that's a mischaracterization, please let me know. But on the one hand, we have the presidential I believe it's called, which is one faction which is more based by Saudi Arabia. Then you have the Southern Transitional Council, which is another entity there in the southern part of Yemen that's more backed by UAE. And so they have also been at times together against the Houthis, and now it seems separate, and there seems to be a deeper background here between Saudi Arabia. So a lot of fragmenting here, but maybe just give us a sense of who the players are on the ground, because I think everyone kind of hears about the Houthis. That's the big conversation. But I think very few people hear about some of the other forces, especially in southern Yemen.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for having me on. Definitely a lot to get into here. You're absolutely right that, at least in the West, a lot of the discussion about Yemen over the years has focused on the Houthi rebels in the north and the role that Iran has been playing in this conflict and the Saudi-led campaign against the Houthis. But also among the Yemeni factions opposed to the Houthis, there have been some important divisions that have sort of come to a fore very recently and played out very violently. When the Saudis led the coalition at first, bringing us back to March 2015, the Saudis and Emiratis were allied in a common struggle against the Houthis. Nonetheless, a few years in, the UAE really took its focus off the fight against the Houthis and began to pursue its more narrow national interests in southern Yemen, which really fit into the UAE's kind of grander agenda of establishing what I would call nothing short of a maritime empire that really is aimed at making the UAE a very dominant player in the Gulf of Aden, the Bab el-Mandab, and the Red Sea. As everyone knows, when it comes to commercial routes, maritime trade, these bodies of water are really critical. The powers that have control and leverage here really have a tremendous amount of leverage over the global economy, mindful of how Europe and Asia trade depends on these bodies of water and these very strategic choke points. And the UAE has tried to achieve its goals in southern Yemen by backing various groups that many would describe as the proxies of the UAE. This brings us to the STC, Southern Transitional Council, which was born out of the Southern movement that really gained a lot of momentum, popularity in the mid-2000s, but really has its roots going back to the 1990s in the aftermath of Yemen's reunification in 1990. Nonetheless, with Emirati support, the STC was established in 2017. It became the dominant Southern separatist movement in Yemen, and it became so powerful because of the UAE's support. Now, Saudi Arabia always had a problem with the UAE's interests and agendas behind the STC, but those differences were mostly dealt with behind closed doors. And what we saw late last month, though, was the tension between Saudi Arabia, which on one side backs Yemen's north-south unity, and the UAE, which has been backing this separatist group, STC. These conflicts of interest became much more direct, leading to what I certainly consider to be a rather unprecedented crisis in the Saudi-UAE alliance. Some people would probably argue that it's no longer appropriate to even refer to this relationship as an alliance. That's how much tension has built up. But just really quickly to get everyone up to speed, what happened at the beginning of December was the STC launched an operation under the banner of countering violent extremism and terrorism. But essentially, as a consequence of the STC's military operations, the group took control of the majority of land in Yemen, putting all the land that used to belong to the state of South Yemen under the control of the STC. But these gains were very short-lived because Saudi Arabia intervened militarily on December 30th with the bombing of the Port Mukalla, and various Yemeni factions backed by Saudi Arabia who are loyal to the UN-recognized government of Yemen also began fighting the STC, quickly reversing the gains that the STC made in Hadramaut and Al-Marra. And now, as we're speaking today, my understanding is that these Saudi-backed Yemeni groups are even coming in on Aden, which has been the power center for the STC. And it might not necessarily be premature to say that, at least for now, the STC as a political body is being, granted, maybe temporarily, but at least for now, sort of being crushed really as we're speaking today.
Giorgio, the news out of from yesterday was crazy because there was an STC delegation that went to Saudi Arabia and then disappeared. Like it seems maybe the Saudis disappeared them, but nobody can get in touch with them. Obviously, the Saudis feel very, very threatened. This has crossed some sort of red line for them. The territorial gains that were made, even though now they've been reversed by the STC, which of course is backed by the Emiratis, as you've explained. So you've got the Emiratis and the Saudis fighting basically a proxy war in Yemen. Before we kind of zoom out and talk more about the regional kind of context here, why does Saudi Arabia see this as such a red line?
Yeah, this is a really important question you're asking. I think we need to see the Saudi perspective here within the context of what the Saudi leadership is trying to achieve internally inside Saudi Arabia. Right now, Saudi Arabia is trying to make Vision 2030 successful. And again, Vision 2030 is this grandiose agenda aimed at weaning the Saudi economy off of oil. And so the Saudis are trying to bring in a tremendous amount of foreign direct investment, build up sectors outside of oil, such as tourism, entertainment, so on and so forth. So basically, in order to make Vision 2030 successful, the Saudis want stability in the countries that are bordering Saudi Arabia. As we all know, for many years, there was a tremendous amount of spillover from Yemen into Saudi Arabia with Houthi missile and drone attacks against Saudi Arabia. There's no way the Saudis will bring in investment to their country if conflicts are spilling into Saudi Arabia. So above all else, what Saudi Arabia right now wants is stability in Yemen. And this explains why since 2022, the Saudis have been so focused on maintaining really a de facto truce, sort of a cold peace with the Houthis. And the view from Saudi Arabia's perspective is that the STC doing what it did in December is just going to invite more chaos and instability in Yemen. And this is the last thing that the Saudis want. And as we've discussed, the UAE has been backing the STC. So there's a tremendous amount of anger in Saudi Arabia right now, believing that the UAE is a driver of instability in Yemen. And as we will probably discuss soon, also a driver of instability in other parts of the Arab world. And we should also note that last year, bringing us back to September, when the STC head was in New York at the UN General Assembly, he was very confident. And he said, if we achieve Southern independence, the official state is called South Arabia, that the STC has been dreaming of establishing for many years. He said, we will normalize with Israel. Essentially, a South Yemen that's independent would be a member of the Abraham Accords. And of course, a number of Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, are very uneasy with the idea of Israel establishing a real foothold in southern Yemen. I think one of the last times I was on your show, we were discussing the Israeli strike against Qatar that took place in September. That has created a new environment in the Gulf where most of the GCC states view Israel as the biggest threat to peace and security in the Gulf. No longer Iran, now Israel. So I just bring that up because the STC's alignment with Israel and its openness to the Abraham Accords is also a very important factor in play.
No, I appreciate that. And it certainly seems that there are a range of regional factors here. So to zoom out a little bit on this exact question, I mean, how does this specific Yemen piece, and I think you've alluded to it here, so maybe just bringing some scaffolding around it, how does what's happening in Yemen build into the broader regional issue between Saudi Arabia and UAE, and where strategically do you think this is going and is likely to perhaps end up in the near future?
Yeah, some people are going as far as saying that what the Arab world is set to experience throughout 2026 and perhaps beyond is really sort of a Saudi Emirati Cold War, if you will. What we see on one side are the Saudis, along with some of their other partners in the neighborhood, Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, that are very much in favor of working with national institutions that they see as the legitimate state institutions in Arab countries, including the relatively new government in Syria, the Sudanese armed forces in Sudan, and the UN recognized government in Yemen, whereas there is an emerging axis made up of the UAE and Israel that supports separatist causes and movements in the neighborhood, not only the STC in Yemen, but also Somaliland in Somalia, and the RSF, Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. And so there's a growing perception on the part of Saudi Arabia and some of these other states in the region that the UAE and Israel are working together to fragment fragile countries in ways that will invite a lot more instability in the years ahead. And both of these sides are lobbying for US support. So there is going to definitely be an interesting power struggle that plays out in Washington as all of this is going on.
And I'm really glad you brought that up. I think when you and I talked about this, you had called it the UAE Israel axis is seen as the axis of fragmentation. So can you talk about, it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's other regional players who view this axis of fragmentation as a threat. So who are these players on sort of like the Saudi side, and what is their response to this?
Yeah, well, so Saudi Arabia, as we know, is wanting to see the territorial integrity of these fragile states survive. This has to do with Yemen, Sudan, Somaliland, and also Syria. And this interest is shared with other countries in the neighborhood too. As I mentioned, Egypt, very recently, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia went to Egypt, and the leadership in Cairo stressed that they're in 100% alignment with Saudi Arabia when it comes to supporting the territorial integrity of these states. Of course, Sudan being an important example, as Egypt has been the number one supporter of the state institution, the Sudanese armed forces fighting the RSF, a paramilitary group. And we also see, in Syria, the Israelis are doing everything they can to totally fragment the country and to exploit grievances on the part of ethnic and religious minorities to kind of balkanize post-Assad Syria. And Turkey and Saudi Arabia are very much against that. They want to see Syria be a unitary state that is not fragmented. And so I think these are kind of the main variables these are the main flashpoints in the region to look at.
Well, Giorgio, as always, you have done what I struggle to do on many of these questions, and that's make it plain for the average everyday person who isn't necessarily following the news. And we appreciate you helping us break this down and always be willing to come on and help us understand what's really happening. Giorgio Cafaro, CEO of Gulf State Analytics. As always, it's an honor.
Good to be with you guys. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Eugene, if it hadn't been for the fact that the U.S. bombed, invaded Caracas and kidnapped the sitting president, and then you had ICE murder somebody yesterday, I think that this would have been a global news headline. Like, that might have been on the front page. It's insane. It's actually insane, the crazy escalation in Yemen, and it's like Hollywood movie. The sort of insane drama that's taking place, in addition to just the insane level of violence. But you can also tell that these countries feel very emboldened to just go all the way because of the new world order the U.S. is creating with a bunch of narco-terrorists at the helm. And I don't mean the people in Venezuela. I mean the people who claim they're going after narco-terrorists in Venezuela. And that's a good segue into our next segment. So I'll hand it over to you, Eugene.
It's a great segue. It's a great segue to our next segment. I appreciate you setting me up there, which is about I don't even know what to call him now. I mean, technically he's the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as many in Latin America call him Narco Rubio, who has emerged as a major figure on the world stage, of course, but his long-term interests in Latin America coming more into focus with the Trump administration actions, kidnapping President Maduro in Venezuela and putting significant pressure on a number of other countries in the region. So to help us understand this sort of broad panoply of issues that are all connected here, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Maureen Kasich, who's an investigations editor at the American Prospect and a senior fellow at the American Economic Liberties Project. Woo, almost lost it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So Narco Rubio, he is this, kind of dyed-in-the-wool neocon, really central casting, and always sort of, to me, and I think that most people who watch politics in America, represented the neocon pole of the Trump coalition, which is generally very much opposed to the America First, and they've been trying to sort of reconcile those two sides and square that circle. And Venezuela is their big project where they've been trying to kind of reconcile those two things by manufacturing this Tren de Aragua hysteria, and then producing these intelligence reports that no one has seen. They're secret, but they are the basis for a lot of the war powers stuff that state that Tren de Aragua actually invaded America and started 500 cells, and is doing paramilitary. Sorry, I think it's 50 cells, but paramilitary activities, and that they, Maduro specifically sent them to infiltrate our country. And this started to get me thinking, what if the opposite is true? It really does seem sometimes, and Maduro has said this, Gilbert Caro, who is one of Leopoldo Lopez's Leopoldo Lopez is a longtime opposition leader in Venezuela and kind of a gangster, but a very handsome guy, lives in Spain now, of course. And he has this sort of scrappier deputy named Gilbert Caro who lives in Miami. He was in a bit of trouble last year because he killed somebody with his car at 4 a.m. and then tried to flee, naturally. So, Maduro has said that he's heard, intercepted FBI tape saying that, that Gilbert Caro actually runs Tren de Aragua, and he's the one who sent all these guys to, do, I don't know, kill Laken Riley or what have you. No evidence as to whether that is true, but it's certainly this sort of thing that the Venezuelan opposition specializes in doing. They have been, to talk about terrorism, they have a very well established pattern, if you actually start to research these things, of doing industrial sabotage, setting oil refineries on fire, causing these unbelievable countrywide blackouts. And I want to give a shout out to the Gray Zone and Max Blumenthal, who runs it, and his wife, Anya Parampil, who wrote a great book called Corporate Coup that, got me up to speed on a lot of this. He got a document in the trial of this guy who's, I think, since, gone missing, a Green Beret, a former Green Beret, who was hired by the previous Trump administration or I should say that I should stop myself. He was encouraged by the previous Trump administration to plot a coup of, a sort of quick and dirty overthrow of Maduro. Back in 2020 was when this Operation Gideon, also known as Bay of Piglets, was supposed to go off in the spring of 2020. I don't know if COVID got in the way; they couldn't do it from home, and it was a sort of debacle. And then they decided, the Biden Justice Department decided to indict Jordan Goudreau, the Green Beret who had set up the company that was going to do this operation in exchange for $100 million in mineral rights or something along those lines. And in his defense attorney has gotten these documents with these proposals, for USAID and for DEA, from groups that are offering to do regime change for, this is the previous Trump administration, and they're offering to do, germ warfare. They're to spread hepatitis in the country clubs in Caracas that the Chavista, intelligentsia goes to. So anyway, long story short, I thought, I've heard that Marco Rubio's brother-in-law was a drug trafficker back in the day, back in the good old days, in the 1980s. I wonder if that drug trafficker has an interesting story. And indeed, as it turns out, his brother-in-law was, nobody that special. He came over in the 1970s and married Rubio's sister and by all accounts, was an otherwise lovely person. Not somebody who was ever implicated in any, gruesome murders, but his direct boss, and he was considered to be the number two, was the son of, this sort of patriarch of the crime organization, was a Bay of Pigs veteran and the former treasurer of the Bay of Pigs veteran organization, which was involved in literally every crazy covert operation that the CIA sort of outsourced to guys who are a little bit scarier than they wanted to be, from JFK on. So, and this guy, Guillaume Tabrau, now, if anyone's seen Tiger King, his son, who sort of took over the family business, was a very, important character on Tiger King. He's the guy from Miami who said that he just sold drugs to support his animal habit. But through this guy's story, you can really tell the story of the Cuban American exiles, why they're so right wing, why, how many of them have, been working for the CIA all those years, and the absolute mendacity of our Latin American policy vis-a-vis drugs and, vis-a-vis everything. How we have over and over and over again throughout the years, tried to overthrow governments in Latin America under the pretense that they are trafficking cocaine or trafficking marijuana, when actually it's our guys who are doing that. And it's generally, the left wingers who are either, trying to diversify the economy, maybe get us out of this business, or, just trying to make a living and trying to organize the farmers to have a little bit more say. So that is, this is something that I thought was really relevant right now, because obviously Trump pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras. His brother was a massive drug trafficker who actually stamped his initials on a lot of the cocaine that he manufactured. The case against him, the indictment is pretty freaking convincing, and that is, I assume why one of the reasons he was convicted. The indictment of Maduro is a joke that raises so many questions. I could, talk for another hour just about that. But it's this pattern over and over again, from Pinochet to, obviously Noriega, to the Argentine dictatorship, to, Bolivia. We have supported right-wing drug traffickers and done everything we can to keep them in control of their countries and in control of the drug supply. And that has been our prerogative. That's one of the reasons. It's not the only reason. There's many reasons we have such a persistent drug problem. But one of the big ones is that we don't actually ever control the supply. We do everything we can to make sure that those folks stay liquid.
I mean, your piece is so incredible. The piece you wrote for the American Prospect, it's so detailed. I really encourage people to go check it out, because you really delve into the history of Marco Rubio and of just like the drugs involved in the anti-communism, and it goes back to Iran-Contra. And what's so wild is your piece was literally published like, I think 11 days before the U.S. went in and bombed Caracas. So it's very, very timely as well. But I think what's so like jarring is to have the fact that you're hearing all this rhetoric about drugs, yet it's basically like the way that Venezuela is going to become a narco state is if the U.S. actually takes it over, because that's what happens to every country. The U.S. takes over in the region. But I wanted to ask you specifically about Marco Rubio here, since you like really delved into him, because he's been so central to the policy, to Trump's policy toward Latin America. I'm wondering if you could just like, how would you describe Rubio's worldview when it comes to Latin America? I know it probably seems pretty black and white, like obviously like historically just like a hardcore anti-communist, but where does it come from politically and historically?
Well, So, Rubio is a guy. It's hard to say because he definitely wasn't. He'll always say I was never much of a student, and he actually got this football scholarship out of high school. But it was to basically like a fake school that was then shut down because they were giving fake football scholarships to, and then he goes and gets an internship for the wife of the guy who prosecuted his brother-in-law, just prosecuted his brother-in-law, but by the way, like a year earlier, and was at the time prosecuting Manuel Noriega, Ileana Ros. I always forget how to pronounce her last name, but a real icon of this of the Congress. Apparently, had amazing constituent services, and the daughter
of
Latinin.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a weird name.
Latinin, yeah, because he is a Dane or something, he's Swedish or something, but she's Cuban. Her father, I think he worked for VOA. So he's part of, that whole, this is the Cuban establishment.
And I'm hearing from the producers, it's Leighton.
Yeah.
Sorry, Ileana Rose Leighton.
Thank you. Now I know. It's all this time. And I keep forgetting to figure out how to pronounce that. So, in the Cuban community, obviously, in the early days, there were a lot of Cubans. There was a lot of discord. There wasn't that kind of, sense of unity that you get now, because the guys who were the Bay of Pigs guys were crazy and they were mobbed up. And in fact, the patriarch, Guillaume Tabrao, of the drug ring that, and this is a big drug ring, 80 million, minimum drug ring, in the 80s when that was a lot of money. I found arrest records of his from Havana and, in the 50s. So he was a potentially a criminal, an alleged criminal before he had even came to Miami. Understandable, there were a lot of mobsters there. But in the early days, there were a lot of people who, for whatever reason they'd wanted, to overthrow Batista. Batista was, disliked. Marco Rubio's parents left because of Batista. And so there's, there was a lot of discord. And I see that today with the Venezuelan community, the Venezuelan expat community. I think that's a big reason that Maria Corina didn't make it, is because she, even among right-wing Venezuelans, they don't like her. I was told by one that she's a socialist, but for the most part, they say she's a crook. And, just
don't
like
tell them
Maduro.
She's not a socialist.
And I know, that was the craziest. And that was from a guy who I called because he'd been filing FOIA requests. And this is, by the way, another of Marco Rubio's jobs right now, is he is the National Archives head. I believe, my sense is that he controls the archives of USAID. There's a lot of, I think, fairly, bombshell stuff in there about, sort of the contours of the money that we've spent trying to do transition in Venezuela. But yeah, where does Rubio get his ideology? I mean, I think he basically just got it from the book of conventional Republican ideology, but he was raised in this sort of, what I'm trying to explain in the story is that he comes from this milieu where that contradiction or that cognitive dissonance of, saying that this is about drugs when actually we're the drug dealers, and sort of this kind of, drugs are bad when poor people do them, but not when we sell them. That cognitive dissonance is much more a part of life. Now, I do think that Marco Rubio, there's some wiggle room. I have been told that it's his aide, Michael Needham, who is considered to be a very formidable organizer, is the guy who kind of convinced the crew that Maria Corina was not it. It's hard to imagine him coming to that on his own, because from my understanding, one of his greatest friends is Alvaro Uribe, the former Colombian prime minister, who is very right-wing and very, very narked up, was actually on a list of top 100, drug lords, put together by the Defense Intelligence Agency in the 90s. Yeah. So this is the guy who goes way back with the drugs. I mean, there's so many connections. It's almost like a joke, you know, and all these guys, you know, you can find Marco Rubio commending their commitment to fighting that drug war. But you know, I also think that he wants to run for president. And if this thing went the way that Guaido did, which is a whole nother story, but it was a utter disaster and comical in many ways, but really gave a little hint into what happens when you put the Venezuelan right-wing opposition in charge of something real, which is, you know, they set money on fire. Like that's what they're good for. I think that Rubio had some sort of a sense that if it went that way, it would be bad for his legacy. And I think he's got enough vanity to sort of, but who knows? These people are doing insane things every day. And I wouldn't put it past them to Libyify this.
Yikes.
I just hope that Maduro can survive till his trial, and, you know, because I can't see that case resulting in a conviction in New York. Miami would be a different story.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to watch. And your article, I totally agree with what Rania was saying. The narco-terrorist elite, you can check it out at prospect.org. Fantastic deep dive, very important for understanding the background. Mo Kasich, thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. I'm such a big fan.
Oh, thank you. Rania?
The feeling is mutual. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah, I read this just before Christmas,
piece.
and it was an amazing to then see everything play out after that. I was like, wow. Anyway, shout out to Mo. Appreciate her coming on.
Yeah.
Definitely check out the article, The Narco-Terrorist Elite, Why is Marco Rubio so hell-bent on making Iran-Contra again, at prospect.org on December 23rd. So I think you can find your way there. We have a very smart audience. Now we want to turn to the same issue, which is the ongoing situation in Venezuela. And we are very, very honored to have with us the Venezuelan journalist based in Caracas, Andreina Chavez Alava. Andreina, thank you so much for being back with us. Oh, looks like you might be muted.
I feel like we had this happen every time.
Yeah.
We're so sorry.
I'm hearing 1 second from the team here. We'll get it together. It's the nature of the game. But, you know, I have to say, Rania, there's a number while we're waiting right now. Oh, wait, maybe she's with us? Andreina, can you hear us? Oh, she can hear us. We still can't hear her. Okay, well, we're going to try to figure that out. Well, anyway, I got sidetracked in my own mind there. But, you know, to be interesting. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how a lot of these things develop, I think, moving forward now, because obviously, you know, we are seeing, ironically enough, and I think, you know, not that I want to date either of us, but I think we're old enough to remember that, you know, usually you have a rally around the flag type of effect that comes around in these sorts of things where the president gets a lot of support. But we're seeing essentially the opposite this time. And in fact, CBS News, so Bari Weiss, not Eugene Puryear, not Breakthrough News, actually just released a poll with YouGov about this issue today. And to read you some of the numbers, 57% of people said they disapprove of the way Trump is handling the situation in Venezuela. And then I think maybe more importantly, in some ways, since Trump has threatened to do more military action, they asked, would you favor or oppose the U.S. taking military action if it's determined that they are not cooperating with U.S. interest? 67% are opposed. There's other things that we could say about that, but we're not seeing sort of like a George Bush mission accomplished type moment, or, you know, whatever it may be. We're seeing sort of from the beginning quite a bit of opposition here in the U.S. And I think that's what's behind the war powers thing, wherever it goes, is I think a lot of these senators, congresspeople in a re-election year are a little concerned that even, you know, across some partisan lines even, there is disquiet to anger on this issue. But now I'm asking you to opine on something. I think we might have Andreina back with us. Let's see. Andreina Chavez, Venezuelan journalist. Are you with us now?
Yes, I am.
Oh,
so
perfect.
thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me again.
Well, we are very happy to have you again, and we really appreciate you being reporting on the ground and bringing that to us. I mean, there's a range of things I guess I want to talk about, but I'll start with this. You know, I think one of the things that has been totally blacked out in the U.S. media is that there have been a lot of very large mobilizations of, supporters of the Bolivarian government, the Chavista movement. I was hoping you could just talk about that a lot, because it's not, even though you can see it online, it's not being talked about at all in the U.S. media in terms of the situation on the ground and the feeling amongst the population.
Yes, of course. I mean, that is absolutely true. In fact, the same morning of the attacks on January 3rd, the first thing that happened was that Venezuelan Chavista, Venezuelan popular organizations, Venezuelan community leaders, they gathered near Miraflores Palace. They marched through the Urdaneta Avenue, and then they created this sort of improvised stage, and there was an open mic. So everybody could go on the stage and just start talking about what just happened. And this is something so representative of Venezuela as a democracy, as a participatory and protagonic democracy, in which anybody who wanted to could go into the stage and just talk about what was happening. So we saw grandpas, we saw workers, we saw women who are community leaders, we saw popular organizers speak on this stage and just denouncing the violation of Venezuelan sovereignty, denouncing that the U.S. Committed war crimes against Venezuela, that they killed innocent people in Venezuela, that they attacked civilian population, and that they kidnapped the constitutional president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro Moros. And so we saw all of these people just denouncing what was happening and just pledging that they were going to defend the homeland. And this is something so important that I've seen several rallies across Caracas in which people have been publicly making this juramento, this pledge that we are not going to give up Venezuelan sovereignty. That happened the very same morning of the attacks. The next day, there was another rally, a much larger rally on Sunday, in which more of the same happened. There was this open stage, an open mic, people denouncing U.S. imperialism. Then the next day, on Tuesday, we saw women take to the streets in Libertador Avenue to specifically support Cilia Flores, the wife of Nicolás Maduro Moros, because Cilia Flores is an elected politician. She's an elected deputy of the National Assembly. So we saw hundreds of thousands of women take to the streets to explicitly support Cilia Flores, to denounce the violation of the rights of Maduro and his wife. And right yesterday, I went to this amazing march in the west of Caracas. It was led by all the country's communes, all the communers. They took to the streets and they were saying, Venezuela has a political project and we are the representative of that political project. Venezuelan communes, which is assembly-driven socialist organization, they are the backbone of Venezuela's political project, and they were defending that this attack by U.S. imperialists didn't mean that the Venezuelan government was defeated, didn't mean that the Venezuelan Bolivarian project was defeated. We have a government in place. We have a Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, who is now acting president. We have a people who continue to be organized, who continue to defend that they are carrying forward a socialist initiative, a socialist project in Venezuela. And that's what we saw yesterday. I actually spoke with several communers, and this is something that is so amazing about the Venezuelan people, that they are so politically conscious. And they were saying, this wasn't an arrest. President Maduro wasn't arrested. He wasn't detained, because in order for that to happen, the United States doesn't have any kind of authority to arrest a sovereign sitting head of state. President Maduro was kidnapped. He was taken against international law. He was taken violating Venezuelan sovereignty. He was taken violating his immunity as a head of state. And the U.S. doesn't have any authority and any right to be prosecuting a constitutional president. And this is what everybody kept telling me, that they understood exactly what was happening. They understood that behind this military operation, that behind this aggression against Venezuela, the agenda behind all of this was the oil, was that the United States wants to take Venezuela's oil and wants to exploit Venezuelan oil. And of course, because they also want to dominate Latin America and the Caribbean. Venezuela is just like the beginning. This is the ground for a major operation that is coming to try to try to dominate Cuba, Mexico, Colombia, and President Trump has already said it. He has already been threatening the Cuban people. He has already been threatening Mexico and Colombia. Marco Rubio, who has an obsession, an ideological war against Cuba and Venezuela, we all know that for him, attacking Venezuela, it is directly related to Cuba because he wants the Cuban government, he wants the Cuban revolutionary process to fall down. So everything has to do with the fact that Venezuela and Cuba are anti-imperialist strong grounds in Latin America, and the factions, these extremist factions in the United States, led by Marco Rubio and Trump, they want to destroy that. So it is a duality. We have the whole Venezuela on the one hand, we see people who are very calm, who the streets are very calm, and everything is peaceful. People are just trying to return to their normal lives. They're trying to continue their daily lives. Every Venezuelan authority has said we need to be complete serene, we need to demonstrate that we have political maturity, and that is what's happening. And at the same time, we have the Chavista people rallying on the streets and demanding the return of President Maduro and his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Andreina, everything you just said contradicts all of the corporate media disinformation that we're hearing here in the US. And I want to actually ask you to address these very straightforwardly. One thing that there's a couple things they're saying in the corporate media. First of all, they're not showing those images of people in the streets denouncing what the Americans did and rallying around their government. Instead, what you're seeing in places like CNN and especially on CBS News, you see these reports that, the streets of Venezuela, everyone's too scared to come out and celebrate what Trump did. They're too scared because the big bad government and all these militias won't let them. In fact, CBS News literally said there was militias hunting people down if they support Trump. That's one. And then the other thing I wanted you to address, you're Venezuelan. We keep hearing people say, listen to Venezuelans, they're all celebrating. And it might be true, there are Venezuelans in Miami celebrating. But I'm just curious if you can address that. We're hearing over and over, every time I turn on CNN, I keep hearing the reporters say, Venezuelans all around the world are celebrating that this happened. So I'm curious if you can address those two talking points. One, that Venezuelans are celebrating what happened. And two, that the idea that there's no space in Venezuela for any dissent. In fact, that Venezuela is some sort of dictatorship where you're not allowed to say anything or you get disappeared or killed.
Yes, indeed. So mainstream media has this obsession of always trying to portray Venezuela as being grateful by the fact that the U.S. is constantly trying to blockade our economy, that is constantly threatening our way of life, and that we are somehow happy that they bombed our country and killed innocent people. That couldn't be farther from the truth. The Venezuelan people are peaceful people. We are people who simply want to defend our sovereignty. The reason why we haven't seen celebrations in the streets of Venezuela is because the majority of the Venezuelan people, regardless of their political affiliation, they do not support U.S. intervention. Even though there might be people who might not be with the Bolivarian government, who might not want President Maduro, they still reject U.S. intervention, especially this kind of intervention that is military. So that is why you don't see that. The majority of Venezuelan people right now are just focused on trying to return to some kind of normality because they disrupted our lives. They created this fear that we are now a country that just went through a military attack, and people are just trying to return to normality. What I've been seeing in the streets, and I live in Caracas. I live in the center of Caracas. I live very close to the seat of power in Caracas. Everything that I've seen is just people very responsibly just returning to the normal economic activities, just people going to work. I've been talking to my neighbors, people in the streets, people in the stores I usually go to, and everybody's saying, we don't want this to happen again. We just don't want this to happen again. Of course, we're going to be ready in case this happens, so people have been buying some food, some water, stuff that they think that they might need. And I've been listening to people say that they feel secure in the fact that we still have a government in place, that there is no chaos, that there is no sensation of we don't know what is happening. We don't know who is the leader now of Venezuela. There is this sense of security that Venezuelan authorities have been able to transmit to the people, that we still have a government, that we still have constitutional order in Venezuela, and that we still have democratic continuity. And that is something that, of course, reflects in the population. That's why people feel this tranquility that Venezuela is still standing. We're still okay. So people are going to work, they're going on their daily lives. Children are getting ready to start school on January 12th. That is all going to happen. And of course, when it comes to mainstream media just showing these images of Venezuelan abroad, I think that is a way to try to discredit the Venezuelan people, to try to defame the Venezuelan people, just by showing these people who most likely, in the most cases, the people who are in Miami, these were people who left Venezuela way too many years ago, and they did it in absolute privileged conditions, and they did it because they lost privileges when they were here in Venezuela, because the Bolivarian Revolution favored the working class. And of course, we're going to see them celebrating, because for them, the recolonization of Venezuela will mean that they will also regain this elite life that they used to have in Venezuela.
Well, a lot to keep following, and certainly we really appreciate you, as always, keeping us up to date, and I'm sure we'll have to keep coming back to you as well, as this is a fast-developing situation. Antonina Chavez on the ground in Caracas, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rania, I think we can keep pushing forward and to continue on this very important topic to get some critical...
I have one thing, before we go to our next guest, I have one thing I need to say. We have a lot of people watching, but not even half of the people watching have liked the show. So I'm going to take a moment to finger wag. Smash that like button, you guys. It's crucial. It boosts us in the algorithm. The engagement helps so that more people see this stream and our other content. So make sure you smash the like button. All right, go Eugene. Back to you.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who is liking the show and everyone who's watching the show and all our previous guests and existing patrons. We want to move on here to get some more context on everything that's happening in Venezuela. We are very honored to be joined once again by Carlos Rohn with the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Carlos, thanks so much for being back with us. Ooh, I think you might be muted.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Thank you very much.
No worries. Absolutely. No, the privilege is all ours. I want to ask you, Interim President Delcy Rodriguez spoke last night, and one of the things she said I thought was very important, and she stated that that relations between the U.S. and Venezuela are historical, they're long-standing, and I think here's the part that I think is important that I want you to address. It was never Venezuela that wanted to break or reduce relations with the United States or anything like that. It was the United States that instituted a hostile policy to break this historic impossible relations. And I think that's an important framing, because the perspective, as you know very well, Carlos, in the Western media is that Venezuela is quote unquote anti-American or anti-US, and that since 1998 has been, against the United States and, not wanting to have diplomatic and economic intercourse.
Well, if you go back to all the history of the Bolivarian Revolution, I mean, first with President Chavez and even now, there has always been this interest in having the relations of respect on an equal footing. There's always been an interest in having trade relations. There was always been an interest in having diplomacy be, the main way of communicating. It really has only been through the massive massive pressure campaign, maximum pressure campaign by the first Trump administration that this escalated into a moment where trade really went down between the two countries. The relationships had to be broken and so forth. I think the U.S. realized. Part of the reasoning behind these actions is the U.S. realized the failure of that policy. The failure of that policy meant, less access to the Venezuelan oil, and which is a necessity for the U.S. infrastructure. It meant, all these losses, really, because of the lack of relations. I mean, if the main problems that the U.S. government faces that usually they address, being migration, drug trafficking, when you go back and you look at the statements, the official statements from Venezuela, there has always been offers to cooperate on this. Just a few, months ago, there was the program, Vuelta a la Patria, Return to the Homeland program. It was implemented, especially for the United States, to bring back migrants that had been refused in the United States. President Maduro, even in his last public interview, a few days, it actually came out right on New Year's Day. He stated how there was interest in working in these issues, in drugs, in all these issues that could, that the U.S. has shown some concern. It's really the lack of the it has been historically the lack of willingness of the United States to approach this diplomatically what has prevented not Venezuela.
Carlos, I think there's this narrative being put out by the Trump administration, by the U.S., that they are now running Venezuela. They're in charge. They succeeded. They did a regime change. They did, of course, kidnap the president, but the people in charge of Venezuela is still the elected government of Venezuela that Maduro was a part of. And I think kind of debunking the framing that the U.S. somehow succeeded right now. One place to start is the narrative the U.S. put out about what happened on January 3rd. Their version of events, which was actually very vague and didn't have very many details to it, was that we went in, got the job done. The media kind of went with it and was like, yeah, there was no resistance. It was bloodless. And basically they just gave up Maduro. And clearly there's people in the government, including the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who were collaborating. All these people just gave up Maduro, Chavismo's over. So I'm curious now that, because I believe that the Venezuelans have actually put out their official version of what took place that day, and there was resistance. So I'm just curious if you could speak to some of those details about what actually went down on January 3rd, because it's actually insane just how much U.S. Firepower and technology went into this operation, which is why they were able to carry it out. But there was, in fact, resistance.
Well, I mean, at Tricontinental, we have often discussed how the U.S. military spends about $1 trillion in the military budget, which has no comparison to any other country on earth. And this means that the technology. I'm not a military expert, but if you hear the different people that have commented in the last couple of days on this, there was new technology that was used by the U.S. There was all these set of. I mean, there was an overwhelming amount of aircraft that came into the country. I mean, over 150 aircrafts by different accounts that came in to carry out this attack. And you're facing a country that, we're not talking about, a superpower like maybe, I don't know, China, Russia. I mean, Venezuela has no nuclear weapons, never, we're a peaceful country. We have never wanted, it's actually forbidden by a constitution to have nuclear weapons. It's a country that was, like any other country, ready for defense, but not for, confrontation in this large scale. And that does not mean there wasn't resistance. I mean, yesterday, Minister Diosdado Cabello spoke about, there were 100, they quantified 100 victims, that died in the confrontation defending the president. And there's many other wounded as well. And it was a struggle, with whatever weapons we had available, whatever technology we had available. But all these, especially there's some young Venezuelans, that patriotically lost their lives in defense of the country, and that's something that has to be taken into consideration. And that I think, if you look overall in the population, people are saddened by what happened, and are very proud of these Venezuelans, and even the Cuban internationalists that were here as well, who lost their lives defending Venezuela's sovereignty and Venezuela's, right to self-determination. I think that is precisely why, when you guys were just talking right now about the mood in the streets, and that is precisely why you don't see these celebrations and these opposition, anybody from the opposition celebrating. I mean, this is tragic. The fact that we had to undergo an aggression of this type, that we have a president that is a prisoner of war right now in the United States, because this was an act of war. And I think, I'm glad to to hear that, just a few minutes ago, there was a vote in the Senate, demanding that the U.S. Or that the administration does not carry out any other attack without the consent of Congress. I think this is important because these are acts of war that need to go through the acts of war that violate international law, that violate U.S. law, and that has to be pinpointed and talked about.
No, I think it's critically important, and I think that we'll hopefully continue to see more discussion around the actual legalities that are at play here, and I think that certainly will be an important part of President Maduro's upcoming trial. And one of the other things that I'm thinking about here that we hear so much is the anti-democratic nature of Venezuela and so on and so forth. But I think it's been interesting from the mass mobilizations to the installment of the National Assembly. I think Delcy Rodriguez spoke from the Jose Felix Ribas commune about the importance of the protagonistic democracy. And then I thought made an important point in her speech last night that one of the key factors of the government is to try to, restore the flow of resource wealth to be able to push forward many of the social missions and other projects that Venezuela has become so known for in empowering the masses of people. But I just thought on so many different levels, Carlos, even in a state of siege, really a state of war, kind of gun to your head scenario, we're actually seeing some of these long-term democratic grassroots-based impulses start to reassert themselves in different ways. And I think that's an important factor of this story too, that is also sort of putting lie to many of the things that are said about Venezuela in the media around the world.
See, you're touching on something very important, Eugene, because I think that the narrative, like you said, that has been constructed about Venezuela, all these negative aspects, the authoritarianism, all these things, what they really do is undermine the reality of a strong political process that is really founded on participatory democracy and direct democracy. I mean, you cannot have unity after an attack as the one we had you not first had an organized people. You first has a race and consciousness, an understanding of a country as a collective, that solutions for the country are part of a collective effort by communes, by social movements, by organized populations, to take democracy into their own hands. And even defense, I have to say, as a Venezuelan, you get a feeling, that when you see the history, the recent history in the last 50 years, these countries that have undergone attacks and invasions and occupations by the United States, you didn't have the level of popular organization, of a strong central government, of a unified revolutionary force like we have. I mean, you see all revolutionary forces leaders have close ranks with acting President Delcy Rodriguez, and that's a very strong statement of unity. So when the liberal media and the mainstream media covers Venezuela, they try to present this as a failed country and a chaos and a mess that doesn't really exist. If we didn't have, and it doesn't exist because we never had this disaster. We had strong organizations, we had strong political leadership. And that's what we're seeing now. So strong that our policies as a country, you hear the government state that they want diplomacy, they want cooperation, they want a scenario of win-win type of relations with other states. You can only do that with the strength of what you have built over the years. And that is what the mainstream media misses. Venezuela is a very interesting political project because it has been able to build on its strong roots of popular organization and clear political leadership.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Carlos, as you're speaking, I'm just thinking about all the ways that Venezuela is described by all these corporate media outlets. And then I'm thinking about the fact that, as I'm sure you saw the news, and we're going to be speaking about this in a bit, you mean Eugene and I, there was this murder, this like point blank street execution of a woman in Minnesota by ICE agents. And it's just interesting and jarring and shocking to see a country that does that kills their own citizens the way the U.S. just did, and then has the President of the United States justifying it and all his cronies justifying it. These are the same exact people who are gunning for Venezuela and saying that Venezuela is a dictatorship that kills its people. So as a Venezuelan, I'm just curious your thoughts when you look at the rhetoric about Venezuela from the U.S. and you know the U.S. I mean, you have family in the U.S. You know what it's like here. I'm not in the U.S. right now, but you know what it's like there. I want to get the Venezuelan perspective on the news you're seeing out of the U.S.
Well, I think it's terrible. I mean, it's terrible that the polarization that has taken place in the sense of having to deal with complex issues like migration without an understanding of what the root causes really are. Approach them with violence. This is something that I think shouldn't happen in any country around the world. Again, like I think that migration is a right. It's a human right, and us in Venezuela, or Venezuelans, have been criminalized. I mean, that part of the aggression during this administration against the Venezuelan people was enacting that Alien Enemies Act. Reviving something that comes from the war of 1812, if I'm not mistaken. It's something obsolete and has no, and also that Venezuela was never in a state of war against the United States, but then you use these legal structures to try to criminalize migration, and that is a disturbing conversation that needs to happen within the United States about how to understand migration, how to not criminalize it, and also what role the United States has played in pushing, originating this migration flows towards it. Overall, I mean, it's not a task for us in Venezuela. It's a task for the people of the United States. But I just want to say, solidarity for with all people that are struggling to make ends meet. These are working class people. The majority of migrants are not people that are coming into to promote crime or to promote hate, and the people, like in this case, that stand up for migrants are also deserve our respect and solidarity as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Carlos Rohn, as always, it's great to have you here. And I want to mention before we let you go, along with your colleague from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Vijay Prasad, you have an important new article out called The Current Situation in Venezuela, A Government in Charge, A People Resilient, that can be found at leftViews.in. As always, Carlos, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Rania, if I can take a point of personal privilege before we move on here.
Is this Congress? Is this Congress?
Yeah, well, listen, what can I say? I like to be proper. I think one important factor of President Trump's announcement regarding at least the allegations around what the deal is between Venezuela and the United States around oil coming from Venezuela to the United States, this has been very uncovered. But he noted that some of the money will be used for material from the electrical grid, in Venezuela will come from the United States to Venezuela. And part of why I want to note that is because, part of what a lot of people don't understand about Venezuela is that because of the long history between the United States and Venezuela, many of the spare parts and other things like that have created serious economic hardships, they have been unable to access because of sanctions. And in the context of what's going on here, where people are spinning a narrative, all sorts of people, including Tariq Ali and others, that somehow, Delcy Rodriguez is selling out the Venezuelan people, I thought that was a very important note in Trump's statement, because that certainly, and if you've been to Venezuela, could result in significant material improvements for the people who are in Venezuela if they're able to bring back the electrical grid. And I want to tie that to the point that I made in a question to Carlos about Delcy Rodriguez's speech last night, where she made the point that their number one goal is to try to generate more income from Venezuela's vast national resources so that they can really roll that back into the country and start to push forward many of the things that help cut poverty. By the the way, in half under President Chavez, and extreme poverty by 70% under President Chavez until sanctions were brought in. And I think that's why we see, the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets constantly every single day all around the country. But in particular in Caracas, we're seeing some of the biggest images, but it's really happening everywhere. That's why we see that there are, all the people who allegedly are against Delcy Rodriguez, Diosdado Cabello, and Nicolas Maduro Guerra are right there and saying that they support her, as well as, pretty much all the people who, if you follow Venezuela, Carmen Melendez and others who have long histories going back to the Chavez era, why we're even seeing some opposition parties work with them. And I think it's because that what is being presented, directly presented by the U.S. media primarily, based on sources within the CIA and the Department of Defense of deep government, whatever, and that the country is fragmenting, is not in fact the case. And the reason why you're seeing sort of a rally around the flag effect, I think, with Delcy Rodriguez's leadership as interim president, is I think anyone on the ground knows it's a very difficult circumstance for the country. The U.S. has put a gun to their head. They're threatening massive military action. They're blockading and sieging the country. But people really believe, and I don't believe that the hundreds of thousands of people in the street are just dupes the way that the right wing says, oh, they only go to those demonstrations because they don't get food if they don't go. I believe that these are protagonistic people who have been supporting a process since 1998. They believe that they are not being sold out by Delcy Rodriguez and the government. They believe that however difficult it may be, that the priority will be to try to maximize the benefit for them while reducing the threat to the country in a situation where, I don't see how anyone on earth would not have to make some level of concession in this space, given what the U.S. is doing with this Trump corollary. So I just wanted to say that because I think there are a lot of people on the internet opining about what's happening in Venezuela, about who's a traitor, about who's this and who's that. And these people know nothing and have no information. I'm sorry. Even the ones saying they're reporting from, sources told me on Telegram or whatever. I actually put my sort of faith as someone from the outside looking in the millions of people who've been supporting the Chavista movement since 1998, who seem to be highly mobilized and inside of their political parties and organizations, highly united around the governmental structure because they believe that this is what they've been supporting since then, not some sort of sellout CIA behind the back handshake type of plot. And I think it's very irresponsible the way people are claiming to be reporting on this. I don't know what their purpose for that is, but I think it's important we look at what's actually happening and not draw conclusions based on things that, are just people saying stuff. So that's an editorial comment from me. That's, Eugene Puryear's editorial comment. But I just, wanted to say that.
Well, I also think it's important to keep in mind, because I've been hearing, just from your average person that I talk to about this, who isn't following the moment to moment, but has followed the news because it's the biggest news story in the world, that like the issue of that he was clearly sold out because of how easy it was for the U.S. to do. I mean, it was a battle. Mm-hmm. A battle took place, and the 150 aircraft is not nothing. Yeah. The U.S. sent 150 aircraft. It was a massive operation. They sent their Delta Force, Vijay Prashad made the really good point. I had him on a live stream a few days ago. He made the really good point that these guys are basically dressed in titanium. It's actually really when you talk about the U.S. military, that $1 trillion a year is going to all these advanced weapons, all this advanced technology, which was apparently able to knock out the communications infrastructure among the military in Venezuela, so they literally couldn't communicate. And also was able to knock out their air defenses. It's also just what people are dressed up in. Think about it's like Israeli soldiers. It's like they can kill 200 Palestinians a day, but the resistance is operating. I mean, I'm not comparing the Palestinian resistance to Venezuela. Venezuela's an actual country, but you are talking about the most advanced military in the world. This is what the U.S. invests in. It invests a lot of it. Doesn't invest money in bridges. It doesn't invest money in healthcare. It does invest a crazy amount of money in its military. And that also means basically having the best gear and the best everything. So they come in with 150 aircraft. They're bombing the country as almost like a distraction from what they're actually there to do, which is to kidnap the president. And they have to shoot their way in for 2 hours and literally execute people who are shooting back at them. So, I just don't think it's, it's this idea that there was just no, the Venezuelans did nothing. There was an order to stand down. There's no evidence of this. And if you've got 100 people dead, including Cuban security detail that was added to help protect Maduro because of how much threat there was against him, then there was an attempt to defend. He didn't surrender. He was kidnapped. He was kidnapped by the most powerful military in the world. And it really is, striking to see that after this insane operation, this raid by the most powerful military in the world against a country that has been, dramatically weakened over the years through sanctions and is much smaller and has I don't know, has anybody done a comparison with how much Venezuela spends on its military versus the US? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Somebody do that for me, please. I'd love to see a graph because I think that would show you that it's actually incredible that after that, Venezuela is still standing, still has a functioning government, and is still moving on day to day. And the U.S. actually didn't succeed in overthrowing the regime, as they said they were trying to do. The U.S. didn't succeed. They succeeded in kidnapping their president because they're a bunch of psychos. But the government of Venezuela is still standing, and there's still support in the streets for it. So
yeah,
make of that what you will.
It is. And just to put an even finer point on that, just in terms of reporting from fact, Mr. Marco Rubio, when he was on the Sunday shows this past Sunday himself, when challenged by reporters saying, well, how come you didn't get all these other people that you say are criminals? He was like, do you think we could do this 5 times on 5 different bases in 5 different ways? Like, look how hard it was to just do one. You know what I mean? And Trump himself saying one of the helicopters majorly injured and 7 soldiers were wounded. So, I mean, even from their own characterization, it's not the case. And it just goes to underline the point you're making. But we'll keep talking about this and keep moving it on. But thank you for indulging my point of personal privilege there, because I feel a lot of just unfounded speculation by people who clearly know nothing and maybe have their own agendas, not appropriate and just not correct in understanding what's going on. Maybe it is appropriate. People can say whatever they want to say, free country or whatever, but it's just not correct in terms of what's going on. So moving on, before we go, Rania, and you reference this off the top, Renee Nicole Good, I don't think there's any way to say it, executed by the U.S. forces from it seems like, I believe, ICE, Department of Homeland Security, yesterday in the context of, well, we're getting different reports now. She may have been a legal observer. She may have been a part of ICE Watch. She may have just been a concerned citizen, but someone who was caught in the midst of ICE's operations in Minneapolis, where the Department of Homeland Security sent ICE. They've sent Border Patrol, by the way, BORTAC, the Border Patrol Special Forces, was out there yesterday as well in terms of quote unquote crowd control. They sent 2,000 people in there to address the allegations, and I just want to say again, allegations around widespread fraud that are being leveled against many different service providers of different types, but under the rubric of the Somali community, as if every Somali in all of the Minneapolis region is somehow involved in some sort of fraudulent scheme. So because of what was really a racist fear-mongering campaign around these allegations, which of course, some of them may be true, there's hundreds of billions of dollars flowing through the US system, all these people are there, their ICE is everywhere, they're all over the place, they're doing raids, they're doing whatever their investigations are, and in the midst of this, there is this moment where Renee Nicole Good and her partner were seemingly observing ICE operations. ICE, confronts them. And in the context of that confrontation, she backs up her car, turns the wheel to the right. So obviously not trying to attack anyone, because if you were trying to run someone over in front of you, wouldn't you just plow straight into them? So she backs it up. She turns the wheel clearly to the right. But for whatever reason, they decide to continue to try to stop her. The officer fires once, and then you can see in the slow motion video that then he fires a second time. I believe this is what we're seeing now, the slow motion video. He fires a second time into the window after he's already out of the way. So you can see here she's pulling forward. You can't hear it, but this is essentially where the shot's fired. And then you have the second shot fired. The guy walks away from the whole thing. So it's being spun by the right wing as an incident of domestic terrorism, that she was trying to run the guy down. I personally do not believe that the video angles that we have seen, there's an investigation going on by the FBI for whatever that is. But from the videos, from the slow motion videos, from the multiple angles, it seems very clear to me that this individual officer could have gotten out of the way without shooting her, that he chose to put himself in front of the car in the first place, that ICE themselves escalated the situation. So, the way it's being presented by the right wing, I think is ridiculous. And I want to just address one thing and turn it over to you, Rania. Vice President J.D. Vance said that it is a tragedy, And the reason it's a tragedy is because of left-wing people who say that the only type of laws that you can violate are immigration laws or whatever. So essentially saying that it's her own fault that she's dead. And it reminded me, of something that Donald Trump Jr. said during the Republican National Convention about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, the Democrats used to have people like Martin Luther King who you could respect. Well, Martin Luther King was the #1 advocate, maybe in the history of this country, of nonviolent civil disobedience. And he was always an advocate of nonviolent civil disobedience being a disruptive force in society. And as he often told, the point of nonviolent civil disobedience was to, in fact, interfere with the structures of injustice that were supporting segregation and apartheid, but to do so peacefully and nonviolently. These were two people, Renee Nicole Good and her partner, who were peacefully and nonviolently observing the actions of ICE, which many people consider to be not only deeply immoral, but akin to the type of racist system that the Jim Crow segregationist South was putting forward, and that other America First type institutions like the Ku Klux Klan were putting forward. And what happened is ICE, armed agents of the state, confronted them, escalated the situation, and executed one of them. And so, which one is it for the Republicans? Should we have respect for the history of nonviolent civil disobedience in this country, of the people like Martin Luther King Jr., who, by the way, they used to always blame things on them too and say anything that happens to them, it's their own fault. When Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were murdered and executed by the Klan in Mississippi, all the authorities in Mississippi said, oh, it's just a hoax and a plot. And they're sitting there in Chicago, and if anything did happen to them, they brought it on themselves by stirring up our Negroes. Well, so what is it? Do we have respect for that history of those who have given their lives and martyred their lives and went to jail for this history of the civil rights movement and others that people are trying to continue today by being determined in a nonviolent way to observe and to protest what's happening with this mass deportation campaign? Or is it a lawless campaign of executions in the street? And I think we know which one of them it is, but it just is important because I think that the manipulation of this idea that people engaging in morally motivated action against this mass deportation campaign in a nonviolent way are somehow criminals and terrorists is deeply problematic, and it has to be stood up against. And I think it is a tragedy, and it's such a shame that someone just for wanting to do what many people would say is right in this country, because a majority of people are against mass deportations, could be executed like this on the street and defamed, by the way.
No, it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. And, it was also kind of predicted because we've watched for the last year as Trump has unleashed ICE and how he's increased hiring with fewer qualifications necessary, fewer training hours, all the things, given them, a blank check to do as they please with impunity. We've seen them beat people up. We've seen them kidnapping people for a year. It's become normal for people to just be disappeared by these guys who have become like Trump's personal militia at this point. And then to see this street execution on video. We can see it on video. We can see this woman trying to leave to save her own life from these thugs on video. And according to eyewitnesses, she was actually given contradictory commands by these people. Like one of them was telling her to leave, one of them was telling her to get out of the car. So, and it's clear from the video, she was trying to get away from a dangerous situation, from people who clearly posed a deadly threat to her, it proved to be. And this guy shot her more than once in the freaking head. It was an execution. And it's so obvious, but what do you see? You see disgusting gaslighting and victim blaming by this regime that you're talking about and all of their supporters online. Just immediately, Trump said, blamed the radical left, blamed the victim. You had Kristi Noem, the head of DHS, calling her a domestic terrorist. You had this repeated by Stephen Miller, because that is how they see anyone who protests their policies or who just opposes their policy. If you oppose these people who are like a Fourth Reich, honestly, you're considered a terrorist to them. They see you as a killable domestic terrorist. And it doesn't matter if you're white, by the way. This is a white woman they killed. It doesn't matter if you're white. You're not their kind of white. Because their kind of white is the kind of white that supports everything Trump does, everything Stephen Miller does, everything Kristi Noem does. unconditionally and supports their right-wing white supremacist agenda. I mean, you had Elon Musk today retweeting Nazi rhetoric. Not the first time he's done it, but it was somebody literally saying that white people are going to be outnumbered, and if they are, the Browns are basically going to kill us all, and that we need white solidarity. And Elon Musk quote tweeted it 100%. And you know what's interesting about that tweet, since he seems to think he still lives in apartheid South Africa, is that white solidarity to them doesn't mean, you know, opposing ICE killing a white woman. I found that to be quite interesting. But no, I mean, all jokes aside, though, that's not really entirely a joke. This is the culmination of a race-baiting campaign across the country to do mass deportations, for one, but also there was a specific campaign against Somali Americans for the past month that has become so insane, where you have, you know, members of Congress calling to subpoena like Keith Ellison and Mike Waltz, of the governor of Minnesota, saying they're involved in some Somali daycare fraud scheme. I don't even understand what drug the right wing is on right now, but it's just racism. But this all, the reason that ICE is behaving this way in Minneapolis is because of Trump's inflammatory rhetoric against Somali Americans, which, by the way, others like Tucker Carlson have participated in as well. And that's how you ended up with this situation, in addition to a culmination of this last year. But it's just disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. And then to see the gaslighting afterwards, like we can't believe our own eyes, is disgusting. And you know that Trump definitely wants escalation here. He would love to see escalation. I mean, they're calling snowballs because you saw that video footage yesterday after the murder of this woman, of residents basically throwing snowballs at ICE cars, trying to like chase them out of their neighborhood. And now snowballs are apparently terrorism. I mean, that's the kind of administration we have, where, you know, when it's their guys, like when it's their people, mobs surrounding cars and going after the left, it's totally fine. But when it's like legitimate protest against the brutality and execution by ICE, you're all domestic terrorists. I mean, this is just horrifying and disgusting. But Eugene, I think something to add to this is related to the militarism of the U.S. in a number of ways. But one I want to raise right now is I'd like to put on screen, as this shooting was like, there was like a developing story yesterday, the killing of this woman. We had a Trump post on Truth Social. And I want to see that Truth Social post. It's important. It's on the screen now. I'm going to read it. He says, after long and difficult negotiations with senators, congressmen, secretaries, and other political representations, I have determined that for the good of our country, especially in these very troubled and dangerous times, our military budget for the year 2027 should not be $1 trillion, but rather $1.5 trillion. This will allow us to build the dream military that we've long been entitled to, and more importantly, that will keep us safe and secure, regardless of foe. And then he goes on to talk about everything amazing he's done. He's better than sleepy Joe Biden, blah, blah, blah. But the point is he's going to increase the military budget to $1.5 trillion. Already we have an insanely bloated military budget. So this is, you know, I want to also play a video clip that I think kind of goes along with this. It's a video clip of J.D. Vance being interviewed, and he talks about Venezuela, but he says some important things that are related to Trump's increase in the military budget, and then I'm going to bring it back to domestic stuff.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Taking out a dictator in Venezuela, how does that help the average American?
Well, a few things, Jesse. First of all, what it means is we're going to be able to control the incredible natural resources of Venezuela, which is good for America in a few ways. Number one, it allows us to put leverage on our enemies. Number two, it makes sure that if Americans need high quality, low cost power, we're always going to have access to it. And then the third thing is it does demonstrate American military excellence, which makes people afraid to cross us in the future. Some of the best ways that you maintain the peace is to make it clear that you carry a very strong sword if you ever need to use it. So I think it's good for us in a lot of different ways. We also have to remember, Jesse, this is in our neighborhood. This is not Iraq. This is not 7,000 miles away. This is in our neighborhood. If we cannot follow the basic principle, which has been a cornerstone of American foreign policy for 200 years, that we control our neighborhood, a lot of bad people are going to take advantage of it. What the President of the United States said is, in our neighborhood, the United States calls the shots. That's the way it's always been. That's the way it is again under the President's leadership.
I mean, just these charlatans who were acting as though they were so opposed to the Iraq war and all these regime change schemes, trying to differentiate Iraq from Venezuela because it's actually okay to do if it's just closer to you geographically. That was the problem with Iraq. But more importantly, you heard what he said there about carrying a big sword and basically having a massive bloated military that does horrible things to scare everyone into submission. So you have this U.S. empire that is just thrashing around so violently because they don't know how to deal with things like a rising China. And they want complete domination militarily over the entire world with their big sword. And they want everybody to stand in fear of them. And that is also the way they're behaving domestically. They are trying to, like the killing of this woman and then the way they cruelly almost gloat about it afterwards. It's also that you are too terrified to stand up to them. It's also that it's to basically deter people. And that's the thing is like they're turning internally on their own population at this point, which they've done kind of in waves throughout history. But this is just such to an extreme degree, at least in our lifetimes, Eugene. I think, I don't think any of us could have imagined how crazy the last year would be. I don't even want to think about how this coming year is going to be if this first week is any indication. But this administration is completely unhinged, completely out of control, and they're prepared to just burn everything down.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we get out of here, I just want to make 2 points. I'm glad you brought up the Somali fraud issue because, you'd think only Somalis did any fraud. But in May, I believe it was May, might have been early June of 2025, Donald Trump pardoned a guy named Lawrence Duran. Lawrence Duran had been sentenced to 50 years in prison for at the time, largest therapy-related Medicare fraud scheme in history, with hundreds of thousands of false claims, $205 million, of which him and his girlfriend received $87 million, pardoned by Donald Trump. And that's not the only person that's been pardoned by Donald Trump who's committed fraud. So they're talking about they want to go after fraud and they're letting them go. But it just shows the reality of what it is they're looking for anything they possibly can to demonize immigrants in order to carry out this campaign of mass deportation. And then the final thing I want to say, and I'm glad you used the word charlatan in relationship to J.D. Vance, because J.D. Vance's big thing, and I mentioned it before, is the problem is the left wing. Oh, wow, as I'm talking right now, it seems like he might even be on TV, so maybe he won't hear me, but maybe he'll see it later. His whole thing is the problem of the left wing because they're doing and Stephen Miller too, they're doing all this rhetoric against ICE, and they're talking about how people are Nazis and all these other things, and you should never do that. Well, one, J.D. Vance called Trump America's Hitler until he realized it was more lucrative for him to be Trump's friend. But beyond that, you look at the rhetoric around immigration that is coming forward. I mean, you've got many people in the broader orbit of the Trump administration, the MAGA the MAGA movement, who, in terms of their mass deportation push and their immigration laws, are touting the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1924, which of course heavily championed by the Ku Klux Klan, whose slogan at the time, which is the height of the Ku Klux Klan, was America First. But just to go one level further, this law in 1924 was praised by Hitler in Mein Kampf. So it's like they're claiming that the rhetoric that's being used by progressive people against this campaign of mass deportations is going too far. But as you pointed out very well, Rania, you've got Elon Musk, essentially arguing that white genocide is coming. You've got the argument for a law that was pushed by the Ku Klux Klan and praised by Hitler. You've got the extreme racism around, all forms of immigration and also around black people in America in the context of quote unquote DEI and all these other things that people are pushing forward. I mean, it really is, it's so clear and it's so plain of day, and there's such a propaganda campaign to try to deny the reality of what they're saying and what they're pushing. It's disgusting. But of course, we will continue to bring you all of the actual things that are going on and the real perspectives here on Breakthrough News. So before we get out of here, Rania, are there things you would like our viewers to know about?
Yes, I want to remind everybody to make sure you hit the like button, smash the like button right now. Oh wow! I got cut off by
wow.
me. No, make sure you smash that like button right now if you haven't already. It helps boost us in the algorithm that hates us. But also make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News. Make sure that you hit the bell so that you get notifications whenever we post new content. And also, if you appreciate our show, our live stream here, if you appreciate all of our other live streams, all of the amazing guests that we bring you, all of the journalism and content that we're doing, please consider becoming a paying member of Breakthrough News, which helps sustain us by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. For as little as $5 a month, you can help support independent media, because man, is it an uphill battle when Larry Ellison owns everything.
Yes, it absolutely is. Well, I couldn't say it better myself, Rania, and of course we will continue to push forward. Check out Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Check out everything we've been doing and will continue to do. For myself, for Rania, for the whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.